Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us in today's webinar, Organizational Interventions for Workplace Bullying. My name is Elizabeth White, and I am the Team Lead of Learning and Development at the Work Wellness Institute, and I'll be here to help moderate and host today's webinar. I would like to start off by acknowledging that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. We would like to take a moment to thank our academic team and 9 founding partner organizations in the Harnessing Talent Project, Harnessing Talent Alliance for recruiting and retaining Canadians with disabilities and mental health challenges is a 3-year project funded by Employment and Social Development Canada. This webinar is made possible through the support of ESDC as well as memberships to WWI. And so we'd like to thank our advisory committee and of course our speakers who contribute to this webinar series. Just a couple moments that I'll take a few technical housekeeping points and get those out of the way as people continue to join. So hopefully at this point you're able to hear me. You can see our title slide on the screen and all of your tech pieces are working. But if not, please look to the menu within GoToWebinar, and that questions box is where your direct portal of communication is with us today, so that we're able to connect with you. And if you have any technical issues, please do send your questions through questions box, as well as when we do have that Q&A session that we hold time for at the end of our time together today, you can use that as your portal to connect with us as well. Also, just to point on kind of what might come next after this webinar, just wanted to let everyone know that you do have the option to, this webinar is recorded and we'll be in contact with you to ensure that you receive the recording as well as the associated material to this presentation. So all of that will be emailed directly to you, and it also will be available on our eCampus post the event as well. Just a last note to our organizational members that you will receive your automatic process of a free certificate of attendance as long as you filled in that record ID field that you were provided at the time of your organizational member. So moving into the topic of today and to introduce our speaker today, we are pleased to have Professor Michelle Tuckey with us. Michelle's program of research examines the connection between work and well-being in order to design and cultivate mentally healthy workplace cultures and work environments. Her research has advanced the risk management of bullying as a health and safety hazard. Michelle regularly applies her research to support organizations to transform working practices, processes, and policies for better well-being and reduced bullying risk. She is an associate editor of the European Journal of Work and Organizational Psychology and serves on the editorial boards of Journal of Occupational Health Psychology and International Journal of Stress Management. Michelle's work has had significant national policy impact in Australia, including one example of when supporting the Australian Human Rights Commission's Set the Standard report on the independent review into Commonwealth parliamentary workplace. So we're very pleased to have you with us today, and I will move things over to you. Thank you for being here and sharing your expertise.
Thanks very much for the invitation and the welcome. And so I'm really pleased to be here today to talk to you about some of the research I've been doing in workplace bullying prevention, which I've been working on for around 17 years now, but this is around a decade program of research specifically towards preventing bullying through organisational interventions. And so just want to acknowledge our various funders of this work, members of my team. Many people have made contributions, and I wouldn't be able to do this work without them, so thank you. So when we think about workplace bullying, many people equate bullying, sorry, my screen's gone a bit weird. Many people equate bullying with bullies. So thinking about bullying, is it the bad apple in the barrel? Is it the office psychopath, the abusive supervisor? And that's also how most current approaches to workplace bullying and prevention and response are framed. So we pay attention to selecting the right individuals within an organisation, educating them around what bullying is through training, also other forms of training to enhance their skills. We've got a policy that says what bullying is, and then of course we ask people to report bullying if it happens, and organisations organisations typically investigate those cases that are raised and might, initiate sanctions or consequences for those people who have allegedly bullied others. But the more complex reality is that bullying is actually a product of the organisational system. So it flourishes when there's an incentive to treat people badly within an organisation, when there's fertile soil for getting away with bullying behaviour, and when there's an event or situation that sparks off the bullying. So we can think about this in terms of enabling factors, motivating factors, and triggers. So enabling factors are that fertile soil that I mentioned, and that's those things that make a work environment conducive to workplace bullying. Power imbalance in particular is a key enabling ingredient, together with low costs for the people that do the bullying. So if people, start to use bullying behaviour and there's no costs for them, then that's a signal that they can keep continuing. Having a lot of stress in the organisational system is also an enabling ingredient for bullying. So high workloads, work pressure, high levels of job demands, they all take time and energy and other resources, and they lower the threshold for aggression in organisations. So though those kind of enablers provide the foundation, they may not actually sustain ongoing patterns of bullying in a work environment unless there's a good reason for people to use bullying behaviour as well. So there's got to be some kind of reward, some kind of payoff for using negative workplace behaviours rather than other types of workplace behaviours. So could that be that there's a lot of red tape and bureaucratic constraints that get in the way? Do people actually get some benefit to their own status or their own position? Do they get access to, finite levels of resources by moving people out of the way? These are all in some way reward bullying from happening. Finally, there's often a trigger situation as well. In the literature, this is typically thought about as some kind of organisational change, whether it be downsizing, changes in management structures, other changes. They not always involved in bullying, but can be the thing that actually sets off the first episode of bullying behaviour, and they can form part of that system of antecedents as well. Managers are most likely to be identified as the perpetrators of bullying, but there's very little data on this in the evidence base. There's one good study from Australia actually that shares insight from managers accused of bullying, and that highlights the nature of bullying as an organisational problem as well, more than just a behavioural issue. So what this study did was interview 24 managers accused of bullying, and they all agreed they'd used some kind of negative behaviour against other people, but most of them thought that they'd never bullied anyone else, even though some of those bullying claims were substantiated. What these managers did was actually talked around, themes around the organisation itself, being part of a stressful work environment themselves, their own role conflict, role ambiguity, high levels of work pressure, and so on. They also talked about just taking reasonable actions as a manager and having some of those perceived to be bullying, or passing down different practices or ways of working in the organisation that some of their employees thought were bullying too. So what this really means is that these findings reflect the same fundamental risk factors as those identified in research with the perspective of targets of bullying, but just at a different layer in the organisational system. Managers are at that next layer up, but they're talking about the same kinds of work environment issues all coming into the bullying process. And so, they're really reinforcing the idea that bullying is an organisational problem over and above being a problem between individuals. And of course, managers can experience bullying as well from the staff that they're supervising, and this is called upwards bullying. These are key themes from a study we're currently writing up now for publication. So this is some emerging research that's not yet out in the literature. But again, it highlights the role of enabling factors, when managers don't have backup support from their senior managers, or when there's a lack of clear formal hierarchy. The credibility might be in question, or when subordinates have some kind of informal power. These tend to be, those fertile soil ingredients for managers to be bullied. Then if it goes unaddressed and reinforced, and it's gets supported and rewarded somehow, they're those motivating factors. And a common one is dissatisfaction in the work group, which spills over into, bullying behaviours towards the manager. And some of the triggers tend to be, changes in team leadership. So if a manager gets promoted from within the team, that's quite a high risk factor for upwards bullying, and specific actions taken as a manager, as a new manager in particular. So again, this is how these organisational ingredients come together to enable managers to be bullied, even though they hold a position that has more formal structural power within an organisation. So it's not just the academic literature that positions bullying as an organisational problem. So around the world and in Australia, bullying is recognised in various areas of practice as stemming from work and organisational factors as well. So in 2015, there was a review of bullying, sexual harassment and discrimination in the surgical profession in Australia and New Zealand. And this is a really good example of how they uncovered bullying to be an organisational issue. And so all of these factors that you can see on the slides here, that's what the review uncovered. First of all was a bullying culture. So there was regular practices of abusing power, together with the expectation that if you want to train to be a surgeon, you have to be mentally tough and you have to be able to cope with all of the bad things that go on in the profession. But trainee surgeons, they had a really strong sense of vulnerability. So there's such a steep hierarchy and difference in power between them and the more senior surgeons. But the senior surgeons are responsible directly for the training of those junior surgeons. So they feel like, there's that their career destiny is in the hands of these more powerful individuals, and that, conversely, it's career suicide if they were to actually, raise a complaint against them. There's also tends to be a lack of accountability and action taken against surgeons that have behaved poorly towards others. Surgeons are really important for the hospital market share, so bringing income into a hospital, and so sometimes that can mean that they become protected. Unhealthy work design was also a factor in bullying, discrimination, and sexual harassment. So particularly unrostered overtime, getting the signal that you shouldn't claim your overtime. If you're a good enough surgeon, you'd be able to get your job done within the working hours and so on. So these kind of workload and work pressures were also enabling soil in this kind of case. This next one I see really commonly in all of my bullying work. So supervisors or people responsible for training others, they tend to have excellent technical skills, but they don't always have the interpersonal skills or the management and supervision skills that are needed to really do that supervisory role. And this was uncovered in this report as well. And then finally, lack of confidence in the reports process. So there was a perception that, and to make a complaint would again have an impact on the career because there's a conflict of interest. The people that they make complaints to were colleagues of the people that were, accused of the bad behaviour, and so there was no sense of being independent or sense of psychological safety there. So all of these things come together to illustrate in a real life context how these organisational issues can show up as bullying, discrimination and harassment in work environments. So one way that I like to think about all of this is to think about bullying as an organisational problem is what I call the iceberg model. So bullying behaviour is what's visible in organisations. It's the tip of the iceberg. It's what we can see, it's what shows up between people. And common anti-bullying interventions, like I've mentioned, so policies, training, reporting, complaints investigation, and so on, they also focus up here at the tip of the iceberg. They focus on the bullying behaviour itself, defining what the behaviour is, outlining how to report it, what the investigation procedure will be, what the consequences are, and so on. So directing attention to the tip of the iceberg in this way, it's actually a necessary part of bullying prevention. We need to have these mechanisms in place in organisations, but it actually overlooks the structural risk factors inherent in the organisational system. So it overlooks these factors that are at the base of the iceberg, which we know from the research literature are the real causes of workplace bullying in work environments. And so if we move our attention from the tip of the iceberg, from the behaviour, and we actually start to focus more on the base of the iceberg, we actually have the opportunity to design out bullying from organisational systems to create the sort of working environments that are healthy and safe for our workers, because we can address the root causes of why and how bullying shows up in workplaces. And that's where organisational interventions come in, which, as I mentioned at the start, I've been spending a lot of my time on in the last 10 years. So participatory organisational interventions, they aim to change workplace policies, procedures and practices in order to improve the health and the well-being of employees. And these kind of interventions, they involve collaborative action at multiple levels to improve how work is designed, organised and managed. And they typically rely on a participatory approach. So both the process of the intervention and the content of the intervention strategies, the actual changes that are made, they're themselves shaped by staff and managers working together. So it's actually, the collaboration of workers in the work environment that drives the whole intervention process. So these kind of interventions, they can be complex to plan, especially implement and evaluate, even more so under the global pandemic conditions that we've been facing, and which is when I've been running a lot of my interventions. But the good news is that they can be successful to change the root causes of bullying and other forms of mistreatment at work. In the case of workplace bullying, then additional goal of these kind of interventions is to transform those underlying conditions within the organisation that are relevant to bullying. So this idea is very much in line with the iceberg model, with the conceptualization of bullying as an organisational problem. So we can't just focus on changing the behaviour. We need to focus first on changing the conditions that come together to enable, reward and trigger the behaviour at all levels in the organisation. And through making these changes at the base of the iceberg, then we can eventually see a change in the top of the iceberg. So my work approaches these organisational interventions for bullying using a 5-stage model. Starts with preparation, so there's a lot involved in setting up the intervention for success, building readiness, building awareness, getting the commitment of senior managers, getting the right resources in play, briefing all of the staff and the managers and generating, their commitment and engagement in the process. Then we go to the diagnosis phase. So this is really important. It's an intelligence-led process. We gather all sorts of information, a risk audit tool that I've designed in my research specific to workplace bullying, which I'll touch on a bit later. And then different types of forms of organisational data too. Have a look at those to try and work out which areas we should focus on. What are those conditions relevant to bullying in the organisation that we should try to tackle with the intervention? And then goes into really the centerpiece of the intervention, which we call the solutions phase. And that's where managers and staff come together to actually unpack the challenges that they're facing in relation to those particular risk areas and generate the solutions. So this is a really core aspect of the research. It's by bringing everyone together, understanding the problem. They generate a shared understanding. They get some alignment between different parts of the organisation on what the problem is, and they work together in generating ideas for how to solve it. These get then turned into an action plan and implemented in the next phase, and we come back and do some evaluation again with a risk audit tool. And other forms of data to try and track the changes. And we collect some qualitative data as well. We do interviews and focus groups to talk to people about what changed and how it changed and link this back up to the outcome data that we've collected too. So this is really similar to the risk management cycle for psychosocial hazards outlined by Safe Work Australia. As I understand it, I think the Canadian approach is reasonably similar to how we think about things in Australia as well. I know you've got some good psychosocial risk standards, and so I'm sure that there's a similar risk management emphasis as well. So, but in Australia, the cycle is identifying the hazards and assessing the nature and the level of risk, putting in place control measures to mitigate the hazards, and then monitoring and evaluating and reviewing and refining things as you go. And as you can see there on the right, consultation with workers is a really important part of this cycle. So the process that I follow, it's grounded in the occupational health psychology literature around how to do organisational interventions, but it is also grounded in the psychosocial hazard risk management literature and following that, data-driven risk management cycle as well. So in the case of bullying then, what are the conditions that we need to address through organisational interventions. So my team and I did some research on this by looking at 342 real-life bullying complaints. So we looked at complaints lodged with our local health and safety regulator, Safe Work South Australia. There was about 5,500 pages of information, so really rich data source. It had the complaint from the complainant, but it also had a number of responses from, the alleged bully, other people in the organisation. There might be HR communications, there might be work health and safety inspector reports. So they're very rich information all around one particular case of bullying. And so what did we find in that research? Well, what it came down to is that, the risk areas for workplace bullying in organisations reside in the management and coordination of people and tasks. So we identified 10 areas, the areas you can see here on the right of the slide. And when these kind of working practices, processes, policies and procedures, when they're not going well in these 10 areas, and that happens systematically over time, then it's likely to create the perception of being bullied. So these fall into three overarching areas: how the working hours and schedules are coordinated and administrated, and that also covers leave and entitlements. How performance is managed, that's everything from having the right kind of job roles and clear role descriptions to having the right training to actually do the work, and ongoing professional development. Then how the performance is appraised and rewarded, the sort of feedback that's given and so on, the actual process of allocating tasks or workload itself, how underperformance is managed, that's the biggest risk area, single risk area for overlap with workplace bullying, around 42% of those cases. And then the last kind of domain is a bit more general. It refers to the fairness or lack of in the workplace relationships at individual and team levels, as well as the general climate for mental health and safety and whether there are physically safe working conditions. So just to give you an example from some of the intervention work that I've done, say someone is working in a supermarket and they've just started. There's not a lot of budget, so they don't get a lot of time for on-the-job training. And so there, that training dimension gets highlighted because there's just not sufficient time to orient people and show them all the tasks they need to do. So they're never quite doing the job properly. They're trying to do their best, but they're falling short of the standards that they need. And there's a lot of time pressure because supermarkets operate on a very lean basis and very tightly held budgets for hours. So there's that task and workload element shows up from the pressure, but also the underperformance element because they're not quite getting there. So the team leader ends up taking on the tasks of the worker. And meanwhile, they're trying to give them some corrective feedback. So this person who's just started is only ever getting negative feedback. It's not getting any positive feedback and reinforcement. So that shows up in that appraising and rewarding job performance element. And so these different domains come together where this person feels mistreated over time by being put in out of their depth and getting, criticized nonstop. And that kind of then spirals into other sorts of behaviours as well. So this is one example of how these factors can come together to result in bullying in a work environment. So after we did this research to identify these 10 areas, we then worked out a way of measuring them. So we use a risk audit tool developed in our research as a guide as to which of those 10 areas to assess, which to target in our intervention process. So it assesses, we have an online version, we have a paper version as shown there, and we get a diagnostic profile from our survey assessment that looks something like this. So this is some data from 10 different supermarkets in one of our Australian states. So these supermarkets, they're located sometimes a couple of 100 kilometres away from each other, but you can see, and some stores score more highly towards the green and other stores are much more riskier to work in. They're in the orange zone. But regardless of whether it's a high scoring store or a lower scoring store, there seems to be a patterning here across the different elements that we measure in our risk audit tool. So there's some kind of system element here. There's something about working in this supermarket system that creates risks for employees. And likewise, when we look at this data from various government departments in a different one of our Australian states, it's a different profile to that supermarket's profile. And even though some of these government departments are in the legal area, some are in the transport area, some are in the regional services area, they're doing very different types of work. There's also a system of risk factors that arise from working in this public service system. So this risk audit tool really is, getting at something about the system of risks that show up as bullying. So that's what we use to work out which areas we should focus on in any particular work environment. And then guided by that diagnostic report, we actually move into the solutions phase, and we use here co-design approaches. So co-design brings together diverse stakeholders on equal ground to generate solutions together. So we typically run a half-a-day workshop. So we get people working in small groups. They unpack the problems in each of those areas, say 3 or 4 of those focus areas, coming up with some of a story like the one I described to you about the supermarket context. And then we use collaborative brainstorming methods to identify what some quick win solutions might be and what some longer term intervention strategies could be as well. So co-design is really important in this phase. It gives both structure and flexibility together. So we have a couple of structured activities, but then it's flexible in the groups as to how and where they go and what they come up with. And integrating the perspective of workers and managers is so important because it enables a good fit to the organisational context and really draws on the expertise of staff and their understanding of their work environment. It promotes collaboration, it brings together multiple perspectives and promotes alignment between managers and staff, so people at different levels, and it builds relationships in and of itself. So co-design is just a really effective part or ingredient in these intervention processes that we run. And the staff involved, they love it. This is some of the feedback, immediately coming out of the workshop when we ask them to describe it in 3 words or less. They think it's engaging, good, fun, informative, helpful, interesting, and they tend to feel excited and motivated and inspired as they're leaving. And likewise, some other types of feedback, from different samples. Again, some of those same positive words. So almost uniformly, inviting people to be at the table to be shaping their work environment for the better. They really get a lot out of that, and they're really glad to be involved. Then we go into the implementation phase. And so teams create an action plan for their quick wins while we synthesize all of the data from the workshop. There's lots of types of data that come out for a bit of a longer term action plan that gets at some of those more systemic issues. But yeah, the teams are driving some actions in their own local areas, and we meet with them monthly to solve any implementation challenges that they might be having, to support project communication, help keep the intervention process alive. And so the goal is to get collaborative implementation happening. So it's not relying on the managers to initiate, but it's actually trying to generate interest and energy from all of the workers involved, and doing that through the workshop so that they can start to carry forward those changes, on a more collective basis. So these are some comments from some of the implementation meetings that we've held as part of these projects. Shifted the mindset, getting diverse people together to think about the issues, and then linking that, to what's already happening day to day. People at the workshop being, the ones to put their hands up and lead this. Moving this out of the HR space, so HR can often feel a big sense of responsibility for trying to drive these changes. This actually shifts the responsibility to leading from within work groups, and HR can provide expert support on areas that are needed. So that's been a good experience as well. And so we've got a lot of good quality data since trying out this intervention process to demonstrate that it works. So here I'm sharing some data from a randomized controlled trial where we had 60 supermarket stores going through this process. 30 went through the intervention as I've described it, and the other 30 were doing business as usual. Then we measured at the halfway point, and just recently the second group of 30 stores, the ones that started off as control stores, they're going through the intervention process as well, even as we speak. But from that first check-in point where we compare the intervention to business as usual, we can see that there's a significant reduction over time in the intervention group that's on the left of the graph in workplace bullying complaints in the stores. over the course of the intervention, but there was no such change in the control group. So this is just one example of the types of effects that we've examined in this research. So we see changes in the risk audit tool scores, those diagnostic profiles to show that there's reduced risk. And this is also showing up at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the workplace bullying complaints that we can see as well. And as well as reducing bullying, the process is actually effective in building a positive culture too. So although we're targeting bullying, bullying is just one way that, unhealthy working conditions can show up in workplaces. And so when we work on those working conditions, there's lots of positive benefits in addition to reducing the risk of bullying. So the staff going through this process, they talk about how it changes the culture. So it's not just about the doing of the project, it gives them a new way of being, a new, more collaborative way of working, and the store being, or the work site, just being more positive now, being more supportive now. They also talk about having a safe space to work on these challenges. So we don't call this project a bullying project, we call it the supportive workplace project. So we frame it up using the iceberg model, and we give a systems view. And so taking that systems view means people that feel safer to raise issues and to be part of the solution as well. And lastly, they talk about cultivating connection, so building stronger relationships between staff and managers, and between different work groups, breaking down insulation between different departments or different areas, for example, within a supermarket, all through working together on these changes. So really positive experience for the people going through, as I've mentioned. And that kind of thing shows up in the culture survey results too. So this is from the regular culture survey that's done by the supermarket group that we were working with. What you can see here is the control stores are the orange stores. They actually had a bit of a decrease in, the experience of culture, or at least no increase over the term of our intervention. But in the green line down the bottom, those stores that went through our intervention, they actually increased. Staff's perception of how positive the culture was increased over time. That yellowish line at the top, that's actually all the other neighbouring stores. They don't know anything about the project, but they're the ones that are located closest to those stores that have come into our randomised controlled trial. So that just serves as another really good benchmark. And you can see, slight but very small changes overall in the culture survey results for those stores. So our intervention stores really having quite an uptick during the project where we were tracking them. So our intervention studies and our evaluation of the process has uncovered 3 different success factors that we think really underpin the success that we've been able to achieve in those organisations. So first, the focus on mitigating organisational system risks, on optimising working practices to foster a healthy work environment. That actually helps staff frame sustainable and effective solutions. So we don't come in and say, oh, tell us how to make your workplace better, or even tell us how to solve your bullying problem. We actually do that diagnostic assessment, and then we focus specifically on those risk contexts in which bullying is likely to emerge in that particular organisation, guided by that diagnostic survey. So in other words, the intervention is data driven. We work where we can create the most improvements. We create that unique diagnostic profile for each local area, as well as sort of being intelligence led. Being able to see your results, really helps people kind of, it connects with them, and like, this research is meaningful because I can see the problems in our store or our area or our team, and I can see how they're pretty similar to other teams, and that kind of thing motivates action and commitment back in the local areas. And then the third thing, and almost the most important thing for me, which I've really enjoyed uncovering and learning about in this intervention research, is just how important meaningful participation and collaboration from all levels is in driving this research. And so actually, I've got a whole slide on this to just highlight how important participation is as a fundamental ingredient. It's an intervention in and of itself. So regardless of the actual changes that are being made, in those areas of the risk context to change the working practices, the fact that co-design participatory methods are used is such a driver of the potential for success. So by, highly embedding participatory approaches in the intervention, you use those skills and expertise of the employees. They can bring those skills to bear, and that feels really good for them. You also make sure the intervention is really relevant to the context. So we've worked in supermarkets, in hospitals, in jails, in youth justice centres, in community service centres, in many government departments. So lots and lots of different work environments. And what makes it possible to do that is by involving people who then work out, what's going to work in their work environment within the constraints of an operating theatre or within the constraints of a prison. What are the strategies that are going to be useful and effective there? Participation also builds resources. So for individuals, they get more of a sense of control, a sense of esteem, from being involved. And for teams, they get more of a sense of cohesion and support and backing each other up. So it's great to build up those positive aspects of work as well as reducing the bullying risk. And it helps meet people's basic psychological needs. So as individuals, as people, we all have some fundamental needs. To feel like people of worth, to feel like we belong, and to be able to shape, what's going on in the world around us. And so interventions can really help, directly meet those needs by involving people in driving and realizing positive changes in their work environment. And lastly, participation smooths the change process. It's very hard to make changes on a group of working people. They need to be involved in and leading the change in order for it to be really effective. So it actually leads to a much better outcome in that regard as well. So as one leader said, in one of our projects, the biggest learning for me is just that the simple things, quite small, simple changes can actually have quite an impact. So it's interesting, just the simplicity of the idea that we change how we work in these areas can actually have these flow-on changes by doing it in a participatory way. So some concluding thoughts then. I've given you a lot of information, but here's what I think are two really important take-home messages. Workplace bullying is typically addressed at the behavioural level. So that's through training, policies, reporting, and investigations. They all focus on workplace bullying behaviour. Now, these approaches provide important safety signals, but they need to be backed up by meaningful action. So when you've got already that ethical infrastructure in place with the policies and training and reporting and so on, effective prevention requires a move to new approaches, system-focused approaches that involve co-designing and implementing solutions that really address the root causes of bullying in the organisational system. So participatory approaches and data-driven organisational interventions, they actually offer a new way of tackling those drivers of bullying at work to support effective culture change while you're also reducing bullying risk. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I'm really happy now to talk with you if there's any questions from those on the webinar about, things that I've talked about through this presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for sharing all of, as you said, that great information with our audience today. And I'll just remind our audience that that questions panel, which you can see within the GoToWebinar menu, is where you can directly connect with us and we can start the conversation. So just reminding everyone there, but we'll kick off with a first question. With one first question here is, so when you were talking about the managers kind of accused of bullying, wondering if within the research project or just within kind of the research that you've done, is there any data on the kind of bullying behaviors that were reported and any kind of uncoverings of perhaps some larger layers of whether that might be discrimination or bias or stigma that's kind of related in this large word of bullying?
Yeah, really important question, actually, and something I've started to think about more carefully. I don't have to hand the information around the upwards bullying of managers, but out of that data set of 342 workplace bullying complaints that we analysed, I've just had a couple of members of my team go through and start to look for the triggers of bullying, the onset of bullying, to try and find out, what those points are. And interestingly, what we're discovering there is that protected characteristics, gender, age, cultural and linguistic diversity, they do form part of a certain subset of bullying cases. So some people are bullied sort of without respect to those characteristics, but in some situation, those kind of structural factors that naturally aligned with and accepted forms of power in our society, when that power and social standing is threatened based on those characteristics such as gender, that can actually be the trigger for the onset of bullying behaviour. And so in a sense, it's similar to forms of discrimination, or bullying is one way of, that kind of discriminatory processes to show up, if that makes sense. So there's not a lot on this in the bullying literature because it's been conceptualized as an organizational problem. A lot of the
Mm-hmm.
focus has been on these work environment factors. But, what we're starting to find in the work that I'm doing just now is just uncovering the deeper things, other forms of power, not just structural organizational power, but these other kind of power bases that we hold as individuals in society and how they come into the bullying picture as well. So that we definitely need more on that type of research. And it's a really good question.
Yeah, very, very layered, I'm sure. It can
Mm,
seemingly, it almost speaks to the iceberg model you said in and of itself, that sometimes there's a tip of the iceberg and there's more layers to uncover
yeah,
underneath.
absolutely.
Yeah, wonderful. So our next question is, so what if you are, you're in your organization, you're looking around anecdotally, you're kind of feeling like there are those pieces to the recipe you almost mentioned earlier of
Mm,
creating almost a bullying culture, and perhaps speaking to some recommendations on what that first step would be if you're getting your spidey
mm,
senses are tingling almost, if you will,
mm.
allow that analogy.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of information that you could turn to that exists in organizations. So you could think about those 10 areas that we've uncovered in our research and start to collect information from exit interviews, from culture surveys, from well-being surveys, from workplace bullying complaints within the organisation in the past. That might be a particularly good source of uncovering, what those risk factors are. Complaints aren't normally used in that way, but that might be a source of intelligence. So start to map out those 10 areas and what's going on and work out which ones might be good ones to focus on. And then start talking with workers. As I said, they play such an important role in understanding the nature of the problem, but in driving any source of change as well. I'd also like to highlight here in response to this question, just how important the role of senior management is.
Mm,
So it's really difficult to actually make changes that reduce bullying risk if you have very senior leaders within an organisation who are displaying those sort of forms of unprofessional or abusive or harmful behaviour. So there's a trickle-down effect that exists when more senior leaders, which spills onto managers at the next layer down and spills over again. And it also kind of shows the sort of behaviours that are valued when the very senior leaders are doing it. So these intervention processes may not work when you've got, disconfirming information coming from senior leaders who are kind of acting in that way. And that's a really important thing to highlight and a really important challenge to resolve that I don't have the answer to. But in a particular work area, going in with the solutions focus, framing it up in terms of a systems issue and collecting data on those 10 different risk factors that might be showing up, talking to workers, talking to the manager of that area around what's going on, and working together towards changes, that's a good recipe for success.
And just to kind of layer onto that question, is there anything that you would perhaps point to differently if you're not in perhaps a manager leadership um, the role, there we go, yourself, and you're actually, maybe in an individual contributor or employee,
Mm.
but you kind of in meetings or again in that more anecdotal way, seeing things, what you can do when you might not have access to those kinds of data points.
Yeah, I wonder if it would be worth going to someone in those areas of responsibility. There is more
Mm-hmm.
responsibility held for bullying prevention um, with people that are leaders in HR and with work group leaders and more senior leaders. So I think, again, going with a systems view and a solutions view can actually be really well received by people in those roles because it's not grumbling about what's going on. It's actually thinking about how we get to making some changes that can show up better. So that would be, I think, one really good way to go about it. Also using mechanisms that are in place. So perhaps you're on, as you don't hold a formal role of power, but you're on a committee that has making some decisions or accessing resources. So there might be an opportunity to start raising kind of systems issues that might be showing up as bullying, but they're likely showing up in other ways as well. Perhaps absenteeism, perhaps people are really stressed, perhaps there's low morale. So it's likely not just to be bullying behaviour that's showing up, but all sorts of other issues. And sometimes those issues are a good avenue into making changes. You know, there's a little bit less tension involved in thinking about, oh, you know, people are withdrawing from work, or they're not showing up, or people are really stressed, and how can we think about starting to make those changes that also has good flow on effects for kind of the bullying behaviour that might be happening as well.
I think those are some great tips in starting that conversation and coming in, like you said, with maybe some systems, some opportunities, so it's not maybe feeling as accusatory or less sensitive. It's such a sensitive topic, right? So any way that you can kind of come in feeling a bit more almost foundational, I think is really helpful. Another question that we had builds on a little bit to what you were talking about around the importance of senior leadership. And I know you spoke a bit around if unfortunately the senior leadership is demonstrating some of those behaviors. However, this question is kind of speaking to the lens of it's not that the leaders are demonstrating the behaviors, but they're not agreeing that the behaviors are happening in the workplace, and so are resistant to all of these, you know, perhaps changes and interventions that could be there.
Yeah, this is another important issue. Without that commitment and signaling from senior managers that it's safe to even raise what's going on and tackle it, again, it's very hard to prevent it. So people, you know, in order to make changes, they need to know that it's safe to actually raise and think about and try and resolve the issues, and they need to expect that meaningful action will occur. And so we've shown up both of these things in our research as well. And so senior leaders in particular play such an important role in signaling that. So I think I'm just affirming really the challenge that's presented in that question there, that when those ingredients aren't in place, it's really important to, it's really difficult, sorry, to get any traction in this area. What I have found though in my own work is that the iceberg model, the systems way of thinking about this actually gives an opportunity to see it as more than a behavioral issue. So if the resistance is sort of to admitting that these kind of behaviors are going on, a different way, a different angle of approaching it can be by changing, you know, working practices and processes that show up in lots of ways that are getting in the way of us doing our work really well in this company. And so it sometimes is a different framing. In Australia, the framing of psychosocial hazards and psychosocial hazard risk management, there's a lot more impetus towards that now. We have a model code of practice in the work health and safety area. Our employers have a positive duty for prevention now in much stronger way than ever before. That's another language that's very senior leaders and board directors need to pay attention to now, because they have an overt responsibility to manage risks. So there are different ways, different framings, different languages that can help. By escalating out into a systems view of this kind of process.
Okay, that's great. A little bit of a know your audience, right? And kind of cater perhaps the way you're communicating.
Tailor the argument or the business case or the
Yeah.
rationale. Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Okay, so the next question we have speaks to almost the current environment we're in, right? There's a switch that we're not always in person. There's hybrid, there's remote environments that we're working on. And just wondering if there has been research or maybe changes in the research when it comes to bullying in a hybrid or remote environment, especially when it might be more difficult to monitor bullying behaviors when it's online, you know, in private Teams chats, for instance, or things like that.
Yeah, spot on. There has been and there is research emerging on this, and as the person raising the question has got a sense of, when we're in these online environments, then it's much more difficult to see what's happening. There's more invisibility. And what that means in terms of those enablers, motivators, and triggers, the costs may be much lower. So that if there's more ability to get away with it, more ability to keep it a secret, then yeah, you lower, you reduce those costs, and that in itself becomes a signal that reinforces that you can get away with that kind of behavior as well. I wonder, on the other hand, though, whether some of these electronic forms like emails may actually more readily give some evidence of what's happening. But the
Right.
tricky situation here is that some of these behaviors individually might not look like bullying. So, what does it mean if you're left off an email?
Mm,
Or excluded from a meeting? It can be sometimes hard to link them all up. If this is happening every day in different ways, there's such a spectrum of things going on, which is part of that process of bullying. It's very hard to point to any one or two or a few things as being problems in and of themselves. So it's a really complex area for those reasons. But with this onset of more, research and activity in terms of cyberbullying, then yeah, we are seeing that those lower cost thresholds can be more of a motivating and enabling ingredient before than when we've had more face-to-face interactions in work environments.
so from that, and if you're kind of wanting to keep an eye, if you will, of just maybe those things that you were mentioning of just is someone consistently getting excluded, like those just kind of maybe a
Mm.
keener eye to are there any patterns building that you might want to be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of anyone that might be on the receiving end of those behaviors,
Hmm.
just think about the idea that bullying requires a power imbalance. So, some kind of imbalance of power.
Right.
Often it's the formal power from a supervisor to a subordinate. But certainly, different forms of social power or holding expertise or having access to resources can all be forms of power that are used to bullying others. So, if you can think about how to topple that power imbalance in a situation, you can protect yourself a bit against
Hmm.
bullying. So I remember one time this happening to me personally in a work environment, behind closed doors, and someone coming past my office and threatening me with this or that or the other. And then something related to that came up in a meeting. And so I just happened to call out that, oh, yeah, this was the issue you brought up the other day, when you came past my office, and calling it out in that sort of public way ended the bullying. And so it was a way of just taking back the power and not being vulnerable. So keep that in mind. Bullying requires that power imbalance. It requires low cost. So if there's a way of increasing the cost or changing up the power imbalance, that can be like an early intervention that targets of bullying can make to actually just shift things around, and it might dissipate.
I think that's a really great reminder that yes, I think we all kind of think bullying and this imbalance of power, but that imbalance of power can look quite different. It's not
Mm,
always that straight and narrow,
exactly.
power of manager, supervisor, that kind of thing. So I think that's a great
Exactly.
reminder.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so looking at the next question around, when we're looking at this co-designing that you mentioned, and we're in
Mm,
kind of the intervention stage, are there recommendations or kind of best ways to really identify and engage the stakeholders? As you mentioned, needs to be kind of this group effort, everybody's around, but maybe if
mm-hmm.
you're in a 500-person organization, not all 500 people can
Mm.
kind of be at that
Oh,
table.
absolutely. Yeah.
So kind of what are those indicators of who the good, the right good, not great words here, but just kind of what that mix might look like.
Yeah, great question. So we've typically asked for nominations, so peer-to-peer nominations for people to come along to the workshop to represent the work groups on their behalf. We ask, in terms of making those nominations, paying respect to diversity, so individual characteristics and diversity, but also diversity in parts of the organization, in organizational level, in tenure, how long have they been there, in the kind of roles they've had. So we really want to maximize the types of voices and experiences that are in the room. This is much better to actually generate better types of strategies and solutions. So that's a really good rationale that you can put forward. Actually, this gives us a better result the more diverse thinking that we have.
Hmm.
But as I also mentioned, it just helps build those resources and build a better process and engagement and ownership and positive outcomes. It kind of brings them forward just from having the co-design. So yeah, peer nominations and supervisor nominations are a good way to elicit that. We try to get Oh, it depends on the size. So in a 500-person organization, I would probably run multiple workshops actually to try and get some representation there. But I would probably also do what we call asynchronous co-design. You might have seen that word on my slide. So synchronous
Yeah.
co-design is when you're bringing everyone together in same space, same time, simultaneously working on the ideas. But asynchronous co-design means that it's happening at different times in different places, and there can be more of a sequence. So you can think about, okay, maybe we get the results of our survey. Do we run a poll? Do we run some focus groups? Do we have some post-it notes up on the whiteboard? Do we get people getting some input in all of the teams? And then we have the workshop, and we come up things with the workshop, and then they go back out to their teams to get more information. So sometimes we split the workshop into two pieces, unpacking the problems and then generating the solutions with time in between those two pieces to go out and touch base with the wider group. Likewise with the action plans, those people at the workshop, they can go back to their local areas and develop the action plan. So the action plan has the inputs from everyone, even though not everyone could be at the workshop themselves. And so, yeah, there's lots and lots of different ways and methods, and reaching everyone is an important indicator of success.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for a very thorough answer there, and lots of great ideas on how you can get those groups together. And building off of that a little bit, I know within the presentation throughout, psychological safety is obviously a theme that's quite important here as well. And just
Mm,
looking to maybe talk a little bit more about that on how you build that psychological safety. So you have all these great
mm,
nominees, they're in the room, but you want it to be an authentic, open, transparent space, and how do you build that when perhaps there is that hesitancy, or can
mm,
I say what I really want to say, or do I need
mm,
to kind of
mm-hmm.
filter before?
Yeah,
Just speak to
so
that a
in
bit.
doing this research, we've had the benefit of being outsiders that have some credibility. So our work in the university is all around work and well-being, creating healthier work environments. Um, we set it up in a systems view, and we create that conditions. We're trusted because we're external. Now, if
Mm-hmm.
that's not the case and internal, then I think these asynchronous methods of co-design can be important leaders up. So you might give people the opportunity to contribute anonymously through a survey, through some kind of discussion forum online that's unpacking the survey results and naming up the challenges. That's where I think there's likely to be maybe greatest risk in people
Right.
describing what the problems are,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe getting some negative consequences from putting that information on the table. So you could do that part asynchronously, and you could do that anonymously, and that offers a bit more psychological safety. And then the forward-looking part, the solutions part, the more, I guess, positively oriented part, that's when you might be able to get everyone together to be part of solving the problem, part of making the change. And if they've
Mm-hmm.
already had a number of opportunities to contribute, and they can see that things are starting to happen. Yes, we have followed up with this. Yes, we are at the workshop. And yes, here are our next steps after the workshop. Then you're building that psychological safety as you go. And even the kind of signal value from coming out of your jobs for half a day and working together in a workshop, that in itself says to people, our well-being is valued. My organization cares about this. I'm being asked for my inputs. Like that in itself creates some safety. And we have this experience in all of our projects, people not really knowing what the project is or how it will
Mm-hmm.
go or whether they should be involved or not. And then after the workshop, they're really on a high because that it's finally all clicked for them there, and then they can go forward really positively.
Okay, wonderful. And maybe you kind of spoke to this already, but just to end our time together, in that idea of, yes, if it's a workshop, whether externally facilitated, internally happening,
Mm,
just some things to build that it's not just today that we're taking it seriously, it will kind of keep that
yes.
momentum will happen after. And you spoke to that a little bit just in that answer, but just
Mm.
wanted the opportunity to expand on that at all before we wrap for today.
Yeah, I think visualizing the project at each stage is really important, and we've heard that in the feedback we've received as well. So, can there be a timeline at the start that shows what's happening and when? And then when we get to the solutions, how are we going to communicate that back and create visibility? So, visibility is the key thing here in response to this question, and being creative in ways of, promoting communicating, promoting different touch points, promoting that visibility of what's happening. And I think that's probably even more important than having external facilitators, just, that visible and that commitment to what's happening, getting senior managers at the start to speak about it, to sign a letter of commitment, to dedicate resources to it. These things can be really important in that perspective as well.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. We are at the top of our hour. I feel like that went very quickly, and so much wonderful information was shared today. And thank you to our audience for being here and participating in such an important topic and conversation. And thank you so much to you, Michelle, for being here and sharing your expertise with us today. Just before we close out, I will remind everyone we have recorded this session. You will receive communication post-event with the recording as well as any associated materials, and it will of course be shared for access within our eCampus. For our members, once again, as long as you followed protocol with recorded IDs and how you've signed up with us originally, your free certificate of attendance will be available to you. And if that's perked your ear and you'd like to join us within our WWI membership, Work Wellness Institute membership, please reach out to our membership services team at membershipservices@workwellnessinstitute.org to learn more. You will see an evaluation survey pop up onto your screen immediately following this webinar. We're so appreciative for anyone taking a few moments to fill that in so that we can ensure our programming continues to be timely and relevant for our audience. One last note here about our webinars are created for public access and supported by both our memberships and funding sponsors. So thank you to all participating in that way. And if you are interested in our full programming of educational resources, please make sure to check out our website. In particular, you can go into courses and really find all of the information you need regarding our webinar programming specifically. And I'll just make a note that our next one will be held on Thursday, November 17th at 9 a.m. Regarding practical interventions for building psychological safety in the workplace with Marianne Bainton, and that will actually be a part of our annual general meeting that day following as well. Thank you again to everyone for tuning in and for sharing this time with us. Thank you again to Michelle for sharing your time with us specifically, and I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day and hopefully see you soon.